Hello and welcome to another episode of Invalid Entry. My name is James Taylor. Today we're going to be looking at some other fundamental forms of cryptography, or some fundamental concepts of cryptography. This is only a very brief high-level introduction, but again it's something I think that engineers should know. It's something I think you should definitely spend more time looking into. So, first thing I think that's interesting is the difference between symmetric and asymmetric cryptography. The very basic principle of symmetric cryptography is you are transmitting a ciphertext across some network to another side where you want to decrypt it, and you could be just putting it into storage, putting it on a hard disk and coming back to it later, or you could be sending it across the internet, you could be sending it via radio, some form of it goes through some phase where you want it secured, i.e. someone else could listen to it or read it or potentially tamper with it. Symmetric cryptography is basically you have some form of secret and you have a process, a function that you transform the input data and you get some output data. And when you actually want to decode it, so you have this encrypted one, you then do the inverse of that. So you still need the same secret, some secret X. It goes into the opposite. So the easy one to think about here is you think about old-fashioned things where you have A, B, and C, and these are just going to move on. Let's say one letter, so A's become B's, B's become C's, and so on until you end up with X, Y, and Z. And at the end there was Z. At the end here you're going to go Y, Z, and then this one becomes A. So if I was going to encrypt some with this, if my name was cab, because I've got it on the screen, so cab, when encrypted, becomes D, B, C. Okay, and there it's encrypted. And the opposite of this is then to move the letters back. So if this was moving the letters backwards, we now look on the bottom row and we see D's are actually C's, B's are actually A's, and then so on. So we're doing the inverse of the previous function. This is really easy if we actually assign these numbers, so 1, 2, and 3. You can see it maps to 2, 3, and 4. So what we're doing here is we're adding 1, and here we're subtracting 1. So it's the inverse, the opposite of adding is subtracting. Same for multiplication. If you're going to use things multiplication, the opposite of multiplication is subtraction. That's symmetric. The main thing is you have the same secret on both sides, and that's a bit of a problem when you're talking about things like transmission, because you've got a problem with how do you get the secret shared in the first place. Now you could use Diffie-Hellman, which I talked about in a previous video, but there are some other problems around this where because you started to distribute a secret, you don't necessarily know who signed it, because if lots of people have the same secret and you want to have that kind of intercommunication method, you don't necessarily know who encrypted it. So there are some advantages to other functions. The main thing about asymmetric is you use a different key or a different process. It's not the inverse of the first process, but obviously it has to lead you back to the same way. And the best way to think about that is if you have some kind of map. So if I this is my home and I want to go down to the shop, here's the shop, and they've got a different thing there. I could go round this road over here, or I could go round this road and it's a completely different road, and that's perfectly fine, right? And what I might do is I might decide that to go there I go down one road, and the opposite I don't have to return via the same path. That would be asymmetric. I can return via a different path, and that's an asymmetric algorithm in a nutshell, is that you don't take the same path through it. I've just got to my screen. Wonderful. I now established where the boundary of my screen was. And the main thing what we're doing for is we're looking for mathematical functions which are what we call trapdoor functions, i.e. they're very easy to go one way, but they're not so easy to go backwards. And a good example of that is powers. So if I say, what's 3 squared? It's very easy to do 3 times 3 is 9. Okay? But when we start saying, what's the square root of 9? that actually becomes a much trickier thing to work out. And that's a good example of a not very big trapdoor function, but where the computational cost to go forwards is different to the computational cost to go backwards. And there's actually an entire branch of mathematics which is based upon that one principle, which is that calculating powers is actually really easy, and the base here can be much bigger and the powers can be much bigger. So we're talking millions of numbers of size in the sort of millions. It's very easy to do that maths. The next thing that maths which became very apparent, which is where RSA cryptography cryptography algorithms like RSA, which is an asymmetric algorithm, comes in, is what we call clock arithmetic. And in clock arithmetic, you have hands on the clock, so you might have 12 at the top, and at the bottom you have 6, and then you have 3 and 9, and of course you have all the numbers in between. So here we have a nice clock going on. And on a clock is interesting because a lot of the time we don't really care how many times round the clock has been. We only care what the clock is currently pointing at, and clocks also generally only go forwards, So very simply, if we have a hand pointing at 11, as the example I always go to, and you say, well, what's 11 plus 2? So I'm going to go 13. Well, on a clock it's not. 11 plus 2 goes to 12, and then it goes to 1. So actually 11 plus 2 is 1 on a 12-hour clock. But we're not limited to 12. We can have a clock with 1,000,000 points on. This is the equivalent of actual remainders. So if you were to do 12 or 11 plus 2 mod 12, that's the way of us actually doing that maths. So the modulus, and in a lot of things, this is the remainder when it's divided by. There's actually very fast ways of calculating that with, a bit like there's very fast ways of building electrical circuits to add two numbers. There's fast ways of calculating the remainders. So now with these two things combined, there is one bit of funky maths left. This is a very powerful bit of maths. This is that for certain rules where m is between 0 and n, m to the e and that to the power of d is equal, and I'm going to use 3 equal signs here, to m. And this is really important. These are not, I know people say, oh, but to the power of a half is a square root. No, these are integers. And it's relatively easy to find numbers which fits these equations. This equals sign here means when mod, mod n. Okay, so it's relatively trivial to find numbers which will fit this equation. And this is a symmetric one because what we're able to do is we're able to give E is the secret on one side, D is a number we publish, so people can then decrypt our number, or rather you can publish E and people can encrypt stuff and send it to us. We keep D as secret, and then we're able to go back to the original numbers. Cryptography at its fundamental is all about mathematics when it comes to these modern crypto. Old-fashioned crypto isn't. Old-fashioned crypto is about symbol replacement, and it's about changing how you're doing the symbol replacement, but modern crypto is all about numbers. So that's a very basic primer on RSA type of cryptography, but shows the idea that there's a trapdoor function. It's easy to go one way, it's very hard to go back, and the same is for elliptic curves. It's very easy to go one way in the curve, it's very hard to then work out what the original points are because there's multiple potential inputs. So when you're thinking about this, when I give the answer as 1, you don't know how many times round the clock it's been to get there. But if you had some inkling, then yes, you could start reducing that down to just a single answer. And that's the difference. It's saying how many potential answers are there for the calculation. That's what makes these things very hard to attack. Fundamentally, symmetric key cryptography is nearly always faster and more efficient than asymmetric. So what we find these days, again, modern, let's say modern, this goes back a long time, 30, 40 years now, we start seeing envelope encryption. And what that means is when we have a large document to encrypt, we actually encrypt it with a random one-time symmetric key. We then encrypt that symmetric key with an asymmetric key. So if I want to send to someone a document which is encrypted, the computer on my behalf will generate a large random symmetric key, encrypt the document with that very, very rapidly, using all kinds of block modes to chunk it down to chunks, encrypt it, and then using the slow RSA function or a slow elliptic curve function will then encrypt that using the asymmetric key and embed that in the document. So when you receive it, you can decrypt the key and then use that key to decrypt the rest of the document. That also has the added benefit that I can send it to more than one person. Instead of encrypting the entire document multiple times, I just encrypt the key for each person who I want to be able to read the document. That's about it for today. As I say, it's a very light, very fast primer on the two fundamental types of cryptography you're going to meet in computing. There are other types of cryptography in the world which have really nothing to do with computing. When you start looking at sort of electronic or methods of transferring things, or if you're looking at things like Caesar ciphers, or these, Caesar ciphers are named after Caesar. It's a Roman era cipher. There was a lot of interest in hiding things, stenography, and hiding messages over the years. A lot of this to do with spies throughout the years, throughout the ages. So you see things about Mary Queen of Scots and those kind of sneaking messages at the tower in a way that was hidden. But these days we're down to just those two most basic types, symmetric and asymmetric. We're still learning about new algorithms. We're currently having, I say we, as if I'm part of this, the human race is currently having a discussion about what's called post-quantum cryptography, because we can predict how quantum computers are going to impact the ability to guess and break ciphers. So we're designing algorithms to be resistant to that. It's very difficult. One of the difficulties is that you may have an algorithm which is very secure, but the implementation when it comes to a computer means you have to make some concessions. And that can mean some fatal flaws. And actually over the years we've seen some really, what we thought at the time were good algorithms be cracked, but at a fundamental level saying no, there are problems with how this algorithm is constructed, which may cause the information to be leaked. Usually that's to do with how data is mapped in the blocking of these algorithms. But that's all I've got time for today, so if you enjoyed this, please hit like, please subscribe, and I will see you tomorrow.